O pala. Pukul bejaman. Anang ukungora ko to. Ukulia pukul arim.
Happy NAIDOC.
That was traditional owner Sammy Wilson at Uluru welcoming us to his Ananu country.
Yilma, hello and welcome to Speaking Up, a special program to mark NAIDOC Week. I'm Dan Borscher, coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra.
And I'm Bridget Brennan, bringing you an Indigenous-led perspective on some of the big issues facing our mob.
NAIDOC celebrates our people, our achievements as well.
And this year's theme, Dan, is a call to get up, stand up and show up.
Well, Bridge, it's been 5 years since the historic Uluru Statement from the Heart really was released, and it was a major call for action.
It really was, Dan, and I've been reflecting on that moment because I was so lucky to be there at the time as a reporter, and I actually had the privilege of going back to Uluru this week to revisit why the statement was written and why that call for a referendum was made. Here on Ananu country at Uluru, there was an historic moment 5 years ago when hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people came here to send a message to the Australian people.
We need what we want.
I was here as a reporter at that time and there was an incredible buzz in the air. Michael, many are saying this is one of the most significant meetings in the past decade for Indigenous Australians.
It's the first time so many Aboriginal people have met at the national level since Eva Valley in 1992, so that's 25 years ago.
At Uluru, a national summit was held to solve years of debate over proposals to change the Australian Constitution. Indigenous people here have said they really feel as though this is their moment to put their voice forward on constitutional recognition. Our founding document is silent on the true history of this country, but changing the Constitution requires a referendum, a vote from all Australians. The Parliament had asked Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to put their ideas forward on the best way to change the Constitution to benefit our people.
What we want. Some people come here and, oh, you got to do this thing, that thing, that thing. And wait, hang on a second. We live in here. What we've been talking, what we want.
Over 6 months, a referendum council travelled all across the country from Brisbane to Broome, Tasmania to the Torres Strait. Finally, 250 delegates met at a national summit at Uluru to come to a final position.
It's about saying we were here, let's recognise that fact, but also let's come together as Australians to really, be united.
This referendum proposal has to be meaningful.
On the final day of the summit, many of the delegates had been up all night finalising the set of words that would become what's now known as the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
Sometimes tense, very robust discussion, a lot of energy. So it was a great day.
The Uluru Statement from the Heart calls for three things: voice, treaty and truth. Let's unpack what that means. A voice created via a referendum would give Indigenous people a national advisory body on the laws and policies which affect First Nations people.
It's about elevating those voices of our mob who haven't been heard before. It's not like they've been silent. They've been out there talking, they've been out there advocating, they've been out there striving for change year after year after year. And the one thing that's not been happening is that their voices have been ignored. And that's what this voice is all about.
Treaty, the recommendation is for a Makarrata, a commission to oversee treaty negotiations between governments and Indigenous nations. And truth, a process to investigate massacres, the loss of land and the broader effects of colonisation. Did everyone at Uluru agree on this position? No, a small number of delegates walked out of the talks and there are still different views on the process and the statement.
We don't need a referendum, we need a sovereign treaty.
There is no other debate allowed in this forum.
But in the end, there was a consensus at Uluru and a path forward to properly including Australia's first people in our founding document.
In terms of the 3 key reforms that came out of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, voice, treaty, truth, there must be difference of opinion. We've got to have a contest of ideas, so it's natural that there are people in our communities that are going to have an opposing view.
We still don't know exactly what powers a voice to Parliament would have, how it would be elected, and how many Indigenous people would be appointed. There's been a lot of heartache about how long it's taken to get a commitment from the federal government to a referendum, and supporters of a voice to Parliament want to vote as soon as next year.
We think, generally speaking, that 2023 is the year, and I think that's a big enough window for us to work through the details of what's being proposed so the Australian people can see what's being put forward to them in the referendum itself.
We're going to be hearing a lot about the Uluru Statement from the Heart in the coming months. To look at the monumental challenges ahead for the new Parliament, it's over to my co-host Dan Bourchier in Canberra.
Yuma, welcome to Ngunnawal Country here in Canberra. I'm Dan Bourchier, and it's the federal parliament behind me that will become the focus of the next big discussion about the inclusion and recognition of Indigenous Australians. That recognition got a powerful boost on election night in May.
On behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
The new federal Labor...
The Prime Minister used his first major interview on 7:30 to outline what he saw as the role of the voice and what it would take to achieve a winning referendum.
What it will take is people of goodwill to recognise that this is just about good manners. It's about First Nations people being consulted about matters that affect them. Now, that's the way I was brought up. It's just what we should do as good human beings and good citizens with each other.
As well as appointing Wiradjuri woman Linda Burney as the first Indigenous woman in Cabinet as Minister for Indigenous Australians, the Prime Minister also appointed Yaru man Senator Patrick Dodson Special Envoy for Reconciliation and the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Senator Dodson sees a big part of his role as bringing people together and dispelling myths about what a voice would be.
This task I have now as an envoy is not a one-man show. I'm holding a canoe, I'm holding a dinghy. I want people to get in it so we can chart a course to where we need to go, and that's the referendum. And those that aren't on side with that, I want to be able to hear what they've got to say and hopefully convince them as to why this is a necessary action of our nation.
Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians Julian Leeser has the task of either bringing his party to the table or explaining why not.
I, as a constitutional conservative who supports the voice and supports it in the Constitution, will be doing my bit as well. But as the opposition, this is a policy that the government took to the election. It's for them to put the first draft on the table.
As well as bringing the Albanese government to power, the May ballot saw the election of the greatest diversity the Parliament has seen, including the highest ever number of Indigenous MPs. There are now 11 Indigenous members of Parliament, 9 of whom are women. They make up 4.8% of all parliamentarians and represent Labor, Greens, Liberal and Country Liberals and an independent. And they have a range of views about whether a voice to Parliament is needed. Australians are notoriously reluctant to change the Constitution. There have been 44 attempts and just 8 successes. In fact, the most successful referendum in Australia's history was to count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australian citizens and to give the Commonwealth the right to make laws for the people of Indigenous descent. That referendum passed by a whopping 90.77% on May 27, 1967. Architects of the Uluru Statement from the Heart will be hoping for a success like that when we are all asked to vote to include a voice to Parliament in the Constitution.
The polling clearly shows, Crosby Textor, Accenture, the Australian Constitutional Values Survey, you name it, that a majority of Australian people would vote yes.
Some Indigenous leaders are now calling for more detail on a referendum model and how an Indigenous voice would be designed.
I haven't seen any model from this government and from the proponents of the voice, and I think they've got to start putting some meat on the bones. Everyone's hearing about the voice and people saying, well, what does that mean? and I think the Australian public are entitled to know as well.
Well, for several years, celebrated elder and Alia woman Auntie Pat Anderson has worked tirelessly to listen to Indigenous people about how they would like to be recognised in the Constitution. She's now co-chair of the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
The respected advocate for the rights and health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people says now is the time to include Indigenous people at the tables where those decisions are made and to truly hear those perspectives. Well, I sat down with Auntie Pat and began by asking about the big yarns that led to Uluru.
We had a series of a deliberative process of meetings, we call them dialogues, regional dialogues around the country. We spoke to, we had 13, we wanted to do more, but the budget only allowed for 13. But out of that process came people from each of those meetings, selected delegates to go to the convention, the Constitutional Convention, which was held at Uluru. I co-chaired the Referendum Council with Mark Liebler and Megan Davis and Noel Pearson. It's a large committee, 16 people. So the culmination of all of that work was the convention, which came up with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which has been people like, former High Court judges and the legal fraternity have said publicly, pretty much straight away, there is no legal impediment to having a voice, a First Nations voice, enshrined in the Constitution. There is no legal impediment. It's to do with politics. So now the leadership that's been provided by our new Prime Minister will look as though it's going to lead to a referendum. So we might get real structural reform after all.
We know that Australians are reluctant to change the Constitution. What the Uluru Statement is calling for is an entrenchment, enshrinement within our foundation document. There's been some discussion that there's not the detail there. What do you say to that?
All we're asking for, and this is done by design, and enabling 2 or 3 sentences in the Constitution. It's not saying change section, section 4, Roman numeral 6. We're not going anywhere near that because we're afraid of putting anything more in the Constitution that might put our sovereignty in danger or under discussion. So it was a purposely made decision to make these simple adjustments. We needed the voice enshrined, a protected voice, enshrined in the Constitution, so the government of the day wouldn't be able to sign us away, which has been the history. In my lifetime, all the government agencies that we've set up, they've been just gotten away with by the whim of the minister or the Prime Minister of the day. And said, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to do this instead. So we need to be enshrined. So when there's a change of government, we'll just sit and wait. And when the new government comes in, or the new Prime Minister, the new ministers will say, well, this is where we got up last time with the other mob, so here we go, this is what we need to do now. Because what happens now, every time there's a change, we have to go back to ground zero, as if nothing has happened. And it just we can't make any real progress here if we keep going, 2 steps forward and 6 back.
So is the idea that you entrench in the Constitution the enabling words to create a item, a voice, and then the detail, does that come through?
That'll be done by legislation, as a lot of other things have been done. You can't put the whole act or the bill in the Constitution, just 2 or 3 very simple sentences which calls for a First Nations voice to be enshrined in the Constitution, which gives that protection we haven't had before. And then all the detail will be done by legislation, which is, sensible, because if we put it in the Constitution, it's locked in there, but if it's by legislation, we can adjust it and change it as we go along.
What did you think when former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull described the Uluru Statement as calling for a 3rd chamber?
Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. And it was really disingenuous. He hasn't spoken to any of us since that time, but it really did. And then Barnaby Joyce came out with he's since apologised, but nevertheless, damage was done.
And just finally, what do you say to Australians watching this right now who still don't know where they sit, aren't fully across all the detail of the conversations that have been had so far?
There's lots to say, but let me just start off. You know, in 67, the wider population didn't even knew less about us than people know now. That's a big challenge because we're asking the population to know very little about us, really. But in 67, you know, people voted because it was the right thing to do. And as people told us, the older people, anyhow, as we went around to the referendum, there's a belief in the common decency of the Australian population, the Australian people. And the argument goes like this, as they told us in different ways. We asked them in 67 to help us, and they did, and we're asking them again in the belief in the common decency of, despite our bloody history and everything that's happened to us, there was this wonderful generosity. I think we must be the most generous people in the whole world.
Auntie Pat Anderson there, and you can watch that full interview on the ABC iView under the NAIDOC tab there. Well, as the new government gets to work, it's hard to think of a more complex portfolio than that of the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
And joining us now for NAIDOC Week is Wiradjuri woman and the Minister, Linda Burney. Minister, thank you so much for making the time for us during NAIDOC Week. I thought I'd ask you what NAIDOC Week means to you and how this year's theme, Get Up, Stand Up, Show Up, really will drive your work through the year.
The theme is fantastic. I particularly like the part about show up. It's a call to the Australian people to stand with First Nations people, particularly in the task that we have ahead. I'm also reminded that we had the Day of Mourning back in 1938, all those years ago, where Aboriginal people said, we want to be recognised, and that's what's going to happen in this term of an Albanese Labor government.
Yes, decades of activism to build on for you and for your colleagues as well. Look, we've heard from some of the advocates for the voice, Dean Parkin earlier speaking about his preference for a referendum date in 2023. I mean, that's less than 6 months away. Do you think that's realistic to get all of the work together and to get a model and a question together in time for the Australian people, 2023?
So, Bridget, I'm not going to be pushed into particular timeframes. Everyone has a view, people have different views, and that's what we want to hear. We've got to consult, we've got to think about this deeply, and we've got to listen to the voices of First Nations people. And I think Pat Anderson is right. Australians want fairness, they want decency. And as the Prime Minister has said, this is a generous invitation. We are asking for an advisory body only, and it will be up to the Parliament to legislate and design that body. Obviously, I'm going to be consulting, trying to build consensus, and listening to people, as Pat Dodson said, listening to people who have different points of view. But in terms of timing, that will be something that we will work through in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, Minister, I know you've already hit the ground running. I know you've been holding forums and talks already with non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. What are you hearing from people? And how do you talk to people who have some opposition for a range of reasons to this proposal?
You listen to people. You understand that in something like designing the voice, working out all the issues that people are highlighting, that you understand that negotiation involves compromise. Not everyone's going to get what they want, but at the end of the day, we all want the one thing. And certainly the Prime Minister has made it very clear that this is a generous invitation and we will deliver on it.
Look, I wanted to also ask you about closing the gap, because there was a bipartisan agreement set with the Coalition of Peaks with dozens of Aboriginal organisations around the country, but there is some urgent work to get to, particularly around our children, Minister. How will you approach this task, because it is really urgent to see some of those targets not go backwards but start going forwards?
We'll work very closely with Pat Turner and the Coalition of the Peaks. They know what's going on in communities, And the other point, of course, is to work closely with states and territories on what they're doing in terms of closing the gap. At the end of the day, it's states and territories that are responsible for education, health systems, child protection systems. So it's about providing support, leadership, and working collaboratively with the states. I'm really encouraged by what many state premiers are saying. Some of them have already started on processes around voice, treaty and truth, and it's about coalescing all of that together and making sure that we're not falling over each other, making sure that there's no duplication. At the end of the day, people have more in common than they have differences, and I think that Australians are fair. Australians want decency, and that is what we're pursuing.
There's a record number of Indigenous parliamentarians in the Parliament now, a really exciting moment for the nation. You're obviously a leader there also. Do you propose to work with those different politicians across the political spectrum to get some sort of consensus, or at least listen to their ideas and different views on Indigenous affairs?
The answer to that, Bridget, is of course. I understand that there are different points of view, and that's a good thing. But the other point is this, is that the voice is not just about symbolism, and I want to really dispel this, this idea. It is about getting more and practical, better outcomes for First Nations people, be it housing, be it child protection, be it incarceration. And I think that the issues that Labor has on its agenda, including around the cashless debit card, the community development program, more health workers, addressing incarceration issues, are issues that are going to really come to the fore when we talk about closing the gap. Closing the gap is really, really important. Some of the targets are going backwards. Some of them are on track, and some of them, as I said, are not on track. But I can tell you this, that the government that I'm part of is determined, absolutely determined, to make a difference in the lives of First Nations people.
Thank you, Linda Burney, for making the time for us during what is a very busy NAIDOC week for us all.
Well, happy NAIDOC and thank you.
And as you mentioned there, Bridget, there are a record number of Aboriginal politicians in the federal parliament, and it's Indigenous women who are leading the way.
They absolutely are, and Gunnar Gooditchmar and Jabberong Green Senator Lydia Thorpe will begin a second term in the parliament soon, and she joins us now from Naarm, Melbourne. Senator, great to have you with us. How does NAIDOC inspire your work, particularly this year's theme?
Oh, well, NAIDOC, it was my life growing up. I couldn't wait for Black Friday to march with my people since I was about 4 or 5. And certainly the theme, I think if every blackfella in the country actually did what the theme says, we wouldn't be having half the battle that we have today. So I think we need to really look at what this means for each and every one of us and see it as a call to action.
Senator, you've got experience of the last term in Parliament. Now we're going to be dealing with many different issues, a refresh closing the gap agenda, the voice to Parliament, which is being pushed by the federal government. But what do you think is the most urgent priority for this new Parliament, given your experience now as a senator?
Well, it's not only my experience as a senator, it's also my experience as a grassroots black activist, a grandmother, a mother, an auntie, a cousin, a sister, and someone who's fought for country and water all her life. So I think that it's time for treaty. I think we need to stop tinkering around the edges and talking about advisory bodies, which we know we've had over decades. They've all failed. Instead of, talking about random things that don't mean much at all is just tinkering. Closing the gap. Like, how many times do we need to be disappointed? Every year we're hearing how bad it is. Treaty is the answer to closing the gap. Treaty is the answer to the issues that our people face in this country, because treaty will give us self-determination to decide our own destiny and our own future.
What's the best way to begin negotiations at a federal level on treaty? Because at a state level, states are beginning different processes and are in the early stages and they're going to take different paths. But what do you think would be the best way to engage so many different mobs around treaty federally?
Well, I think we need to be guided by the United Nations or the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which, might I add, the Victorian government, the Labor Victorian government, did not want in the legislation that is currently there for treaty in Victoria. They also did not want an elder's voice in that legislation, which I fought hard for. So unless we're going into negotiations in good faith, such as adhering to the rights, our rights, then we can't negotiate. We've got to be on an even playing field. And I can't sit here as a Victorian senator and say what each and every mob wants and needs around this country. The government and whoever wants a treaty with us needs to talk to the mobs themselves, because they know the solutions for their own communities and they know what their priorities are, and that will be different amongst different mobs. If we go back to reconciliation 21 years ago, you look at the most comprehensive consultation this country has ever seen with blackfellas, we need to do that again. It can't be up to politicians and so-called leaders who were invited to the Uluru meeting, and I hear Auntie Pat Anderson say invited delegates. That's the problem. We need grassroots people at the table. Stop discounting them and seeing them as troublemakers and activists. Bring everyone into the tent, because that's what a treaty is, and that's the only way we're going to unite this nation as well as unite ourselves at the same time.
Just briefly, Senator, tell us about what you think are some urgent priorities for Aboriginal women, because this is an area of great passion for you.
Well, already my colleague Senator Cox, Dorinda Cox, and I have introduced an inquiry into the federal parliament for missing and murdered black women and children. Now, it's the first of its kind. It took 2 black senators, Green senators, to come in their first term and put something out there that no one's ever done before, including the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. They're 2 pieces of very important work that have been supported by both sides that will make the lives of Aboriginal women and children and people in this country a little bit better until we get the other things sorted, like deaths in custody, like suicide, like the poverty that so many of our people still experience in this country today.
Senator Lydia Thorpe, always great to talk to you, and a happy NAIDOC, and wishing you a lovely NAIDOC weekend to come.
Happy NAIDOC.
And we had also hoped to speak with incoming Country Liberal Party Senator for the Northern Territory, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, but she's out bush getting across a very big electorate of the Northern Territory right now, so we couldn't have a yarn with her. But don't worry, there'll be plenty of time to talk. We've got lots more conversations down the track. We've been hearing a lot about the Uluru Statement, but we know there's also a huge amount of work to do, Bridget, around Close the Gap, as you were just mentioning.
There really is, Dan. And political reporter and Palawa Plunga Marina woman Dana Morse takes a look at some of the other urgent priorities for all governments.
We will work with you. This thing can be done.
A changing government means a changed approach to Indigenous affairs. A referendum and the Uluru Statement from the Heart are the starting point for the Albanese government when it comes to building its Indigenous affairs legacy. But we know there are other urgent priorities for our communities.
The conditions that our people still endure in the 21st century is absolutely appalling, and we must improve the quality of life for our people.
It's been 14 years since the landmark commitment to closing the life expectancy gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry.
Since then, Prime Ministers have come and gone.
Danayi, Nunawul, Dara.
But there's been little progress, and in many areas the gap is actually widening. So there's been a push to rethink how billions of dollars are being spent. In a partnership with Aboriginal organisations, governments across Australia have agreed to 17 refreshed targets.
Well, essentially they were failing. There wasn't an authentic partnership with people having communities, leaders and community organisations having a say in the decisions that impact on our health.
On average, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are dying 10 years before other Australians, and that gap increases in regional and remote communities. The Albanese government has told us addressing the rising cost of living and improving housing and employment programs are all top of the agenda. Housing plays a major role in the health and happiness of First Nations people. And the pandemic has again exposed shocking overcrowding in many areas. The Closing the Gap agreement says Indigenous people need affordable homes, and the government has promised to fund repairs in remote communities, but that'll still leave a lot of people without somewhere to live. And with a rental crisis, housing prices out of reach, and construction shortages slowing up new builds, it's not an easy problem to solve.
So housing is really, really critical to health. It's one of the 10 important social determinants of health. Poor housing is associated with lots of childhood communicable diseases or infectious diseases. These are conditions that you usually don't see in high-income countries.
All Australians are feeling the pinch at the moment, but it hits particularly hard for First Nations families, especially those living in regional or remote parts of the country, where there's high freight costs and little competition to keep prices low. Even before the rise in inflation, remote communities were paying much more for their weekly shop, and prices are only continuing to rise. It means people simply can't afford essentials, and that can lead to poorer health outcomes.
You just can't imagine paying so much money for fruit and vegetables when they look old, mouldy or saggy and not fresh.
Employment goes hand in hand with health and housing, but only around half of Indigenous Australians aged 24 to 65 have a job. The aim is to improve that to 2/3 by 2031, but some past policy has done real harm in this area, like the Community Development Program in remote Australia. The Albanese government has vowed to scrap the CDP and proposes to come up with its own model. Despite the challenges ahead, for those who have worked tirelessly to advocate for our people, NAIDOC brings a time for reflection on the ongoing fight for equity.
So I celebrate, the elders who've come before us and the struggle that they've had and whose shoulders we stand upon today. And we've got to continue the legacy that they left us because there's too much unfinished business.
We've heard from so many deadly women on Speaking Up tonight, all doing amazing work for equality, for justice for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander.
Yeah, black women leading the way. And to reflect on some of those wins, let's go to Adjunct Professor Janine Mohammed. She's the Chief Executive of the Uluru Institute.
And Chief Executive of SNAKE, the National Voice for Our Children, Catherine Little. Welcome both of you to the program. Catherine, I want to start with you first on this question of what's your assessment of where Closing the Gap is at?
I think we're starting to see some progress in the priority reforms, but I think at this point in time, everyone's going to tell you we're still walking when what we actually need to be doing is sprinting.
And Janine, what about you?
Oh yeah, I completely agree with Catherine, and the gap is something that, all Australians want closed. I was there in 2008 when we came together with the Commonwealth Government to sign, that Close the Gap Statement of Intent, and we've had targets in place since then. We have seen progress, but not nearly enough. It's so slow. And when you think it's been 15 years, especially in terms of incarceration and our children and out-of-home care, that's a lot of trauma and suffering in those 15 years. So for me, same as Catherine, the lack of progress comes down to political will and the need to do things differently. And that national agreement on Close the Gap is all about structural and system reform. But it is great and deadly to see so many Aboriginal women in the system now. Gone are the days when non-Indigenous people are leading the discussions on our behalf and about us. So, with our new minister and the CEO of NIAA, our Aboriginal Women's, I'm sure that we're going to see positive indication into the future.
Yeah, well, there are monumental challenges, as you both just said. What gives you hope, especially during NAIDOC, and what are some of the wins you're seeing? You've both worked over decades with Aboriginal families. What gives you some glimmer of hope? Catherine, I'll start with you.
Sorry. What gives me a glimmer of hope? Listen, I am a true believer that, and I think Lydia spoke to this a bit as well, is that on the ground, our mob know what the solutions are. And what I'm really enthused about at the time is the commitment to shared partnership agreement, shared decision making, means that those of us that represent the service sector have a whole new scope of work to do in getting in the rooms and hearing the solutions from our people. What gives me hope is they understand what it is that they need, how to overcome those barriers, and that they keep coming back to that rooms despite the fact that over many, many decades there's been so little progress, but they're back at the table and they're saying, we can do this and we can do this together. And I have seen some incredible movement on the ground by just being in the room, listening to what needs to be said, and then working with governments on how we might start moving those big system blockages that are making this so slow.
And Janine, what about for you?
Oh, like all social challenges, there's no silver bullet. And, equity is really about meeting people where they're at. And as Catherine said, having place-based solutions, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander-led solutions, and we have the solutions. Some of the things that really give me hope, post-COVID was those numbers that we saw for Aboriginal-led solutions in COVID. We were 6 times less likely to get COVID, when we were trusted by government. I think some of the amazing solutions that we see is birthing on country for our women when women have choices within the system. And I think, for non-Indigenous Australia, when I walk down the street now and I see, all those amazing allied T-shirts and people really wanting to engage with, Aboriginal voices and what we have to say and the solutions that we have to offer.
Catherine, there's a bit of a narrative about why a voice when there are so many other issues. You've both touched on some of those, closing the gap, for example, out-of-home care, incarceration rates. Do you see it as one or the other?
No, I don't. I think they're two sides of the same coin, and I think, I try and rationalise this in my head all the time. How do you explain how these two components can work together? And I think the best analogy I can come up with is it's like a car, and this is what I know about our mob. Our mob are the best bush mechanics, right? We know how to put something together. So I like to think of the work that we do in closing the gap and working with the coalition as like an engine, right? This is service delivery. This is making all the pistons work, and we can have 12 cylinders pumping away, right? So that engine is doing exactly what it needs to do. However, if we haven't built the chassis around it, if we haven't put in the steering wheel, if we haven't put in the wheels, it's a bit harder to get that engine to move from A to B. If we have something like the Voice that is able to progress other massive pieces of legislative reform, then those two components should work together to have a purpose-built, an Aboriginal designed and purpose-built vehicle that will start moving these things at a pace that I don't think anyone could imagine.
Janine, it looked like you were nodding away furiously there. Are you on the same page? Two sides of the same coin?
I was having a little giggle to myself thinking, the car would have to be red, because red ones go faster.
Goes faster.
I think a voice to Parliament, and we can have it all. I think sometimes we've been, so starved as Indigenous people that we think we have to choose one. But I do believe that it is possible to have it all. A voice to Parliament to me would, mean that that ignoring that invisible feeling that we have as Indigenous people, remembering that we've had many petitions to Parliament since the 1800s, and those, petitions have been largely met with distraction methods or simply an experience of absolute silence. So for me, it would mean that we're finally listened to and heard, and to have that voice enshrined in the highest law in the country, which can't be dismantled then by governments at their whim. I would feel that we'd have a deeply profound effect, and we see that when we had the apology, what that meant for Australia, and we'd be able to provide advice on laws that affect us as Indigenous peoples with a genuine two-way conversation. It's important unfinished business, yeah.
Look, appreciate both of your insights, leaders in your own fields and well respected across the Indigenous landscape. Adjunct Professor Janine Mohammed and Catherine Little, thanks so much for joining us here on Speaking Up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy NAIDOC.
Happy NAIDOC. Well, Dan, one of the other long-term aspirations for our mob, which has really never gone away, is treaty and truth-telling. And this was also discussed at Uluru, and now there are treaties being signed in some of our states as well.
And treaties have been signed internationally for hundreds of years. Well, as you've been mentioning, there's finally that momentum here in Australia. Durable woman Isabella Tolhurst takes a look at what treaties and truth-telling could mean for the nation.
Here in Naarm, Melbourne, Aboriginal people have begun a historic path to treaty. Signing a treaty here would be a major moment, marking Australia's first ever treaty with its First Nations people. But what is a treaty, and what does it mean? A treaty is an official agreement between First Nations people and the state or government. Treaties can see the return of ownership of land, acknowledgement of injustices that were faced, and can see First Nations people receive compensation and more autonomy.
The ultimate objective of First Nations around the world is to achieve some level of self-governance.
A treaty is something our communities have been calling for and have been promised for decades.
There shall be a treaty. You, the Aboriginal people, should decide what it is that you want to see in that treaty.
But treaties can take years to negotiate. Here in the Victorian Parliament, a bill was recently passed to create a treaty authority, establishing an impartial umpire to oversee treaty negotiations.
It's about hope. Really, it's about changing how we do business. It's making sure that what we do is we get that genuine self-determination and empowerment.
Other states are also on their own paths to treaty, reshaping relationships between First Nations people and the settler state. In the Northern Territory, there's a recommendation for different Aboriginal governments to deliver services to their communities. And there's also some very early movement towards treaties in Queensland, South Australia and Tasmania. While it's great to see that progress is being made, it's important to note that Australia is a long way behind other colonised countries. In Canada, 70 treaties were signed between 1701 and 1923, but in the past 50 years, a further 25 modern treaties have been signed. These have provided Indigenous people with land ownership, protection of traditional ways of life, and certain self-governance rights. Closer to home, in New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840. They now have a tribunal that oversees everything from the preservation of language to land rights to the protection of culture. Back on our own shores, we're also being inspired by overseas models to investigate past wrongs. This includes the start of Australia's first truth-telling commission, launched here in Charcoal Lane in Melbourne. The Uluru Commission sees First Nations people share their experiences of injustice to help inform treaty. And while we're still a while off signing anything yet, many people in the community say it's a step in the right direction.
We've been here for over 80,000 years. We were taking care of our own business then if we've continued to do that.
Well, Dan, so many perspectives tonight on the big issues facing our mob, and during NAIDOC week, it's just great to hear the diversity and the difference of opinion on the road ahead. And this is really just the beginning of the next big discussion about inclusion.
Get up, stand up, show up, an invitation and challenge to all of us from here in Ngunnawal Country, Yarra. Good night.